The story happened to my college friend Jindo when he was young, about 12 years old. At that time, Jindo's family was also well off. Although living in the countryside, their lives were relatively sufficient. The story involved a strange black cat. On a sweltering summer night, Jindo was awakened by a cry which was like a baby crying. Curious, Jindo crawled closer to the window to see where the cry was coming from. Around him, both mom and dad were sleeping soundly. Jindo looked through the window. There was a black cat standing on the roof of the opposite house, which is his grandfather's house. Looking closer, he felt quite strange, because the black cat was standing on its hind legs like a human and acting quite strangely and confusingly. It was like the cat was dancing. The eyes of the cat suddenly lit up with a ghostly blue light. His mouth was howling with pitiful screams, which was very shrill and scary. Being too young, Jindo didn't know what he was doing, so he could only be still and peek through the window passionately. The black cat continued dancing like it was praying for something, which looked like rites of the shamans in the movies we often saw. Suddenly, a voice went out to interrupt Jindo's training of thought. He turned around and saw his mother. Because it was midnight and Jindo still hadn't slept, she scolded him. After hearing the mother complain, Jindo suddenly remembered the black cat, so he still tried to look over the opposite house and wonder if the black cat was still dancing or not. But maybe hearing the voice of Jindo and his mother, the cat stopped standing on his 2 feet and glanced at Jindo with those blue eyes. Then he jumped away and disappeared. Fearing that his mother would worry, Jindo also quickly returned to his bed to continue sleeping. Jindo's mother also wondered what Jindo was looking at outside the window intently at midnight. The next morning, everything was fine. Jindo also forgot what he had seen the night before. After lunch, Jindo was planning to go out to play with the neighborhood kids. Suddenly, something caught his eye. It was the black cat the previous night. Jindo suddenly remembered all the strange things he had seen. The black cat was lying on the wall and sunbathing like the other normal cats. Hearing the sound, he opened his eyes to look at Jindo. Then I turned to the other direction to sleep again. Jindo had a feeling that the cat was sulking because Jindo had disturbed him last night. But he was young. He didn't care too much about it. Until that night, something unexpected and heartbreaking happened to Jindo's family. His grandfather had a stroke and died. By the time he was taken to the hospital, it was too late. The doctor also diagnosed that grandfather couldn't be cured anymore, so he asked Jindo's family to take the grandfather home. As soon as possible, the family gathered to say goodbye to him. Everyone was heartbroken and cried a lot because of the surprising death of Jindo's grandfather. Normally, he was very healthy without any illness, but he passed away so quickly. Jindo is also very sad. He cried a lot. He almost forgot the cat which had danced on the roof of his grandpa's house the previous night. Suddenly, the meow of a cat caught Jindo's attention. The strange thing is that at that time there were many people around, but no one noticed the sound of the cat. Maybe everyone was crying about the sad event, so they didn't care much. But Jindo was the one who heard the sound the most clearly. He rushed to the glass door and pressed his face against it to see what the black cat was doing. On the dark and winding country road outside, Jindo saw a small black cat ahead, leading someone behind. It was too dark, so he couldn't recognize who was there. The cat kept leading the way and making squeals. Not knowing what to push forward, Jindo ran out into the yard and turned on the front light to illuminate who the black cat was leading. As soon as he turned on the light in front of the house, Jindo was dumbfounded by what he saw. The dim shadow gradually approached under the moonlight and the light that Jindo had just opened. He could clearly see the shape of a man. The black cat was still walking slowly and looking back. It seemed the cat urged the man to go faster. Jindo's eyes widened in surprise because that man was his grandfather. Apparently he had died and his body was still inside the house. How could he appear out here? He shouted for everyone to get out. He said that his grandpa was back and the cat brought him back to his family. Inside, everyone was standing around the grandfather's body to mourn. Suddenly, hearing Jindo's screams, they startled and turned their heads to the door. Worried about what happened to Jindo, the family's members panicked and got out together into the yard to see what was going on. Jindo stood outside. He innocently said that Grandpa had returned. He pointed at the black cat and firmly asserted that it was the cat that led him home to his family. Everyone stood around the cat and saw nothing but a small black animal, so they thought that Jindo was making up stories to make fun of the family. In the midst of grief, Jindo was scolded by his father for making up stories. Then the family quietly went back inside. They left bewildered Jindo behind. Jindo scratched his head. He blankly looked at the black cat next to him. The animal also looked back at him. Then Jindo thought that maybe he was really wrong. While he was thinking, there was a scream from inside the house. It was Jindo's father. The screams were so loud and panicked that even Jindo was standing in the yard startled. Jindo also got into the house hurriedly to see what caused his father to scream in panic. As soon as he opened the door, Jindo saw his father was sitting on the floor and trembling with fear. Jindo looked up and shouted like his father, even more scared, because the grandfather's body suddenly could sit up normally on the bed, which scared the whole family so much that everyone fell to the floor. Jindo, Grandpa, was not a ghost because he sat up and made some dry coughs. His skin was also rosy again, like a normal person. Seeing that, the whole family was less afraid. Everybody gradually approached them. They wondered and asked a lot of questions. They didn't dare to believe that he was really alive or not. What they had seen was so strange, almost impossible. Because the hospital confirmed his death and his body also became pale and cold, how could he be revived like a miracle? The body was indeed very warm when touched. At this point, people believed that he was really alive. Jindo's mother also burst into tears of joy. As soon as he stopped coughing, the first question he asked was not about his family, but about the black cat. He said that it had brought him home. No one understood what he was talking about. He hurried to get out of bed and insisted on looking for the black cat despite everyone's objections because of his very weak health. Only Jindo understood what he was talking about. He glanced at the yard, suddenly remembering the black cat which had stood outside. Jindo hurried out into the yard to look for the cat as he realized that this animal had known of his grandfather's death that night. With a strange dance, the cat had been begging for something to help his grandfather. Although Jindo went around, he still couldn't find the black cat. He did not see the cat again in the following years. When Jindo was older, he realized that the figure which he saw that night was the spirit of his grandfather. His grandfather also said that before the event happened, he used to take care of that feral cat for several years. It occurred in Tai Po Town, Hong Kong in 2013. I wouldn't say exactly which hospital and which district it was in, because I was still working there. It was my second year working in this hospital and I had grown accustomed to the job, so my working attitude became sluggish. I was hiding in the corner of the stairs one afternoon to smoke a cigarette when I heard a nurse call my name. "Dr. Jin? I have a patient who requires surgery." It turned out that a patient had just been taken to the emergency room with an injury that required immediate surgery. At the time, I wasn't the primary surgeon, but I was also a doctor. I didn't dare to ignore it at that time, so I immediately threw the cigarette butt away and dashed into the operating room with the nurse. I was a step behind schedule, and the patient was ushered into the emergency operating room. The treating doctor didn't even reprimand me. He simply told me to disinfect and get to work. I packed my belongings and rushed to the surgery room, and it was only then that I noticed the patient's wound. The patient had a severe wound, with the lower half of the arm completely gone. Despite my limited experience, I could see that the wound wasn't cut, that the arm had been completely ripped off by some force. This type of injury was uncommon, and it was also the most difficult type of hand surgery in which I had been directly involved. The surgery took more than 5 hours to complete, and we did our best to treat all of the nerves and blood vessels in the patient's wounded arm. When I arrived at work the next day, the patient had awakened, and I had learned about his condition during the sessions. "How did you get injured like this?" I inquired. To be honest, I didn't care how his injury occurred. When he came to recall the reason, he had a terrifying expression on his face, as if he was hesitant to tell. His family lived in a rural suburb, a small fishing village by the sea, he said. While many people in the village relied on fishing for a living, his family was an exception. They relied on farming to support their family. Because there was a lot of arable land in the village, he told everyone in his family to clean up to start planting, and his family agreed. So, during this time he plowed the land, digging for many years without planting anything, and he was extremely tired, but he felt happy. He was digging in the ground the other day when he came to a halt with a stunned expression. He turned over his pickaxe and saw that it was a human skull, and half of it was rotting. Although this was not a good omen, he didn't take it too seriously because his ancestors had lived here for many generations, so the ground had buried a few dead people. Furthermore, those bones had been here for more than a dozen years. The ghost had long since reincarnated, and he threw all the bones he dug out on the grass at the field's edge. After a while, many more bone fragments were dug out one by one, but they were all broken up. When he finished digging, there was already a pile of bones lying there, and it appeared to be quite complete. He didn't think it was good to be seen by others, so he returned home after burying the bones. He lived in the westernmost part of the village, away from other people's homes. All of the family's children worked in the city, and he was the only one who lived here alone. He was tired all day, so he went to bed early and fell asleep without noticing. He was awakened unexpectedly in the middle of the night by a knock on the door. The sound was becoming increasingly louder as if someone outside was knocking on the door. Whoever came to the door at this hour astounded him. Just as he was about to get up, the door of the room was violently opened. At the door, a shadow appeared. He inquired several times, but the shadow did not respond, and instead entered the room very naturally, as if it were a place devoid of people. As it got closer, he realized it was an old man dressed in antique clothing who looked very scary. But the old man only had one arm and shouted at him as he approached. The old man asked him to give back his arm because he had lost one, but this was a ridiculous request. The old man reacted hastily. Maybe today the skeleton he discovered in the ground had come to haunt him. Perhaps he lost a portion of the old man's arm while digging up bones. However, his bones were also discovered in a state of disarray. The old man walked over to the bed and grabbed his arm before he could react. He was not sure how skinny old man could be so strong. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pain in his arm, and the elderly man with extraordinary strength yanked his arm away. The old man ripped his arm off and caused him great pain. The intense pain and fear caused his mind to go blank, and he couldn't feel anything. Then he passed out. When neighbors heard the screams, they discovered that he was injured badly and took him to the hospital. He had no idea where the ghost had taken his arm. The neighbors searched for a long time but were unable to locate it. After hearing what he said, I was speechless. I thought he was maybe suffering from a mental illness, so I summoned his son and told him to look after his father, fearing that his self-harming behavior would interfere with the treatment. But I could tell his son was uninterested in what I had to say because he believed his father's story was true. I didn't think it was necessary to say anything else, so I went back to my business that day, thinking I'd find out later. Then his son came to tell me that he had returned to the village to check on his father's request. Sure enough, his son discovered the small mound that his father had built. Then he dug it up to double check and was very careful in doing so. His son saw the scattered bones as his father described them, and he did not lie. The son simply put the bones together out of curiosity, and it turned out that a piece of arm bone was indeed missing. What was more terrifying was that his son discovered in that grave the piece of his father's arm that had been rotting with maggots. Only then did his son fully believe his father wasn't lying, and that the unjust spirit had ripped off his father's hand. This is a true story that is widely known in my village. People in the village still refer to this story as a haunting horror experience to this day. A long time ago, a wealthy family in my village reconstructed a dowry house. When it was completed, the owner of the house lavished the villagers with a big party. The party went on until the middle of the night. Everyone drank a lot until they blushed as they walked out. Following the departure of the guests, the residents of the house began to clean and rest in the new home. But in the middle of the night, while lying on the newly constructed bed, the owner felt extremely uneasy. He kept tossing and turning all night, unable to sleep, and then experienced severe stomach pain, cold and shivering all over his body. When he couldn't take it any longer, he turned to call his wife, who was lying next to him, to check on him. But he called again and again. His wife did not answer, so he went off to bed alone and checked the house's fireplace. As soon as he set his foot on the brick floor, his entire body became cold with such an unpleasant chill. He took a few steps, felt uneasy and looked back with trepidation. When he looked at the bed, he found himself lying motionlessly there. His entire face was white, his eyes wide open as if he was a corpse. He was terrified by the scene. He mumbled a few sentences, pointed to his own body, shivered, then held. He took a step back, seeing himself lying on the bed, but appearing to be placed on a coffin. He fainted out of fear, and gloomy darkness enveloped the space in front of his eyes. The wife awoke the next morning to prepare breakfast as usual. She waited for so long, but her husband never came out for breakfast. She entered the room to check. However, when she arrived, her husband's body was cold, but his pulse was still present, albeit weakly. She and her children rushed her husband to the hospital for an examination. However, no doctor was able to diagnose his illness. Her family agreed to let him stay in the hospital for an extended period of time, but there was no progress, so they returned him home in pain. At the hospital, his grandson stood behind his mother, concernedly looking at him. The house's owner at this time was in a coma, looking exactly like he had died. The whole face had begun to turn grey because of lack of breath. His son took his wife and children home to seek for treatment after completing the procedure at the hospital. Everyone in the house had been worriedly waiting beside his bed all night. Because the grandson needed to go to the toilet late at night, he took a flashlight and went out to the toilet alone. But as soon as he got to the door, a strange noise came from behind the child, like a large animal breathing. He turned his head towards the noise and noticed a figure twice the size of an adult slowly walking into the courtyard. That piqued the boy's interest, and he crouched silently behind him, watching this colossal monstrosity himself. The monstrosity rushed in front of the boy, dragging an iron chain on the ground, resounding throughout the yard. The boy assumed that was a thief in his house, so he recklessly approached and asked loudly who he was. But he didn't seem to hear his voice, and he went straight to the owner's room window. The boy went to the door, shouted loudly, and called his parents for help because he was afraid the giant would harm his grandfather. But as he moved forward, the giant's face appeared, clearly in the light, revealing the form of a long-tongued demon. His cheekbones protruded, and he slowly turned his face to look at him, showing his long tongue, which was long enough to touch the ground and threaten the poor boy. The scene caused him to panic and scream. His parents became terrified too when they heard his screams outside. The two dashed out to find him and discovered him sitting on the ground in front of the door to the grandpa's room. When his parents saw this, they immediately came over and helped him up. The two immediately inquired as to what had just happened. The boy cried out and pointed forward, claiming to have encountered a demon. Then he described the entire appearance of the demon he had encountered. At first, his parents didn't believe him. However, because of his tenacity, the two hesitated. His mother appeared to have recognized the problem and immediately advised her husband to invite a good shaman in the village to come over. The house's owner's son invited a shaman that night. This was my village's most well-known one. As soon as he walked into the house, he went to the owner's bed and took his pulse to check on his situation. After checking his pulse, he sighed and stated that the house's owner had a strange disease that he had never seen before. When her daughter-in-law heard it, she burst into tears, worrying that he would never wake up again. The shaman couldn't ignore after seeing it, but he needed more time to figure out what was causing it. He stood up and walked around, his hands clasped behind his back. A pensive and tense expression appeared on his face. Suddenly he turned to look at the man's bed, and his face changed color, revealing surprise. He was serious when he asked the daughter-in-law to find him a tape measure. He took it and carefully measured around the owner's bed. Nobody knew what he aimed for. He was measuring and calculating solemnly by pressing his knuckles. Then his face revealed a mixture of surprise and concern. He looked up at the daughter-in-law who was standing in front of him and asked her who built and designed this bed. The daughter-in-law attempted to recall and confirm with the shaman that this bed was designed by a builder. Later, the daughter-in-law added that her father and the builder had a falling out while the house was being constructed. Her father assaulted the builder, injuring him, and deducted a week's wages from him. The shaman immediately recognized the root of the problem after hearing the story. He was enraged, yelling at the builder for being a jerk. He pointed to the bed and told everyone in the house to dismantle it as soon as possible because it was actually a coffin. Everyone in the family initially didn't believe it, but when they double-checked it, everyone was shocked and had to admit it. The shaman then explained that in order to exact revenge on the owner, the builder purposefully fashioned his bed in the shape of a coffin and imprisoned the owner's soul within it. The homeowner's son and a few neighbors used a hammer to break the bed, as instructed by the shaman. Every brick had been broken and was scattered everywhere, with dust flying. After a while, the cement and sand bricks that served as the bed's background appeared, along with a paper doll in the center. The landlord's son and the shaman picked up the doll, and the owner's full name was written on the back. The shaman then prepared a cup of tonic for the host, which he carefully served to him. After half an hour of taking the medicine, the host moved slowly opening his eyes, as if he had just awoken. He opened his eyes and looked up at everyone in the house, his face worried and scared, as if he had just woken up from a nightmare. Despite the treatment, the owner's spirit was not much better as a result of a neurological complication, becoming a famous story in the village, and the builder also met with disaster later. This heartbreaking story took place in a small city in the north. The pitiful but also blameworthy person in this story was a boy named Beto. The boy's mother died early in an accident, so he lived with his father. At first, the father and son's life was very peaceful and happy, but a year later, his father married a new wife, and his life also started to be sad from that point on. Since his stepmother moved in together, Beto was beaten and scolded by his father, even though his father had never done it before. On the contrary, Beto's father always loved his new wife very much. Sometimes later, Beto learned that his stepmother was pregnant. The quarrels between him and his father became more and more intense. In the eyes of Beto's father now, he was a rebellious and stubborn boy who was disruptive. In Beto's heart, there was only one mother. He did not accept and allow the stepmother to take the place of his mother. Time flew. The stepmother's belly was getting bigger and bigger. One day, after his father and stepmother went shopping together for the baby, they also bought Beto a clothed doll. Beto saw the gift, but he did not feel happy. On the contrary, he became angrier because he thought his stepmother was deliberately humiliating him, assuming that he had the same hobbies as girls. Afraid of affecting the fetus and affecting his wife, Beto's father silently threatened to force him to learn to be obedient if Beto did not want his pocket money to be cut. Because Beto didn't want to be with his stepmother, he made excuses to eat outside every day. Without pocket money, he wouldn't be able to live. Beto reluctantly accepted the doll and sadly went back to his room. He couldn't hide his anger, so he slammed the door in front of his father and stepmother. Outside, the father and stepmother were also tired of Beto's ignorant and disrespectful behavior. After entering the room, Beto directly threw the doll on the ground and cried silently on the bed. At this time, he felt very lonely and sad. Beto cried out alone for an hour and fell asleep because he was tired. The following morning, when Beto woke up, he saw the doll sitting on the ground. The more he looked at it, the more sulky Beto felt. He angrily picked up the doll and was about to throw it out. As soon as he went to the door, Beto saw his stepmother going somewhere. The hatred in the boy's heart began to rise. Beto suddenly had an idea and threw the doll towards his stepmother. He immediately called his stepmother and asked her to help pick up the doll. The stepmother turned her head when she heard Beto's voice and couldn't help but be surprised to see that the doll she gave Beto yesterday was lying at her feet. Seeing that his stepmother didn't say anything nor react, Beto pretended to care about his stepmother and said he would pick it up himself. Seeing that, the stepmother thought that Beto had accepted her, so she was happy and wanted to pick up the doll for him. After saying that, she slowly bent down to pick up the doll. Beto also took the opportunity to sneak around behind his stepmother's back. Then Beto quickly pushed the stepmother's back with his hand. Due to loss of balance, the stepmother fell forward. Because her belly was too big, it hit the ground hard. The stepmother began to feel severe abdominal pain, then fainted from loss of blood. At this point, under her body was all blood, and the baby in her belly was dead. The blood flowed out in a stream and stuck to the doll next to it. Beto looked at his stepmother lying on the ground, a satisfied smile on the corner of his mouth. At that time, the boy felt happy that no one could take his father anymore. Beto hurriedly picked up the doll and hurriedly left. Then he threw the doll in the corner of the room where no one else could find it. Next, he pretended to be the first person to spot the injured person and called for an ambulance. After taking the stepmother to the hospital, Beto became a hero. Because the doctors all said that if it came a little later, the mother's life could not be saved. Although the fetus died, Beto's stepmother was fine. Beto's father immediately wanted to buy some food to nourish his wife. He also told Beto to take care of his stepmother. Beto's father didn't wait for him to answer, then hurriedly left, leaving Beto alone in the emergency room. Beto looked at the shadow of his father was far away. Suddenly, he felt extremely scared. He was worried that if his stepmother woke up, the truth would be surely exposed. Beto went inside and took a sneak peek. At this time, the stepmother woke up and couldn't help but mourn for the dead baby. Beto saw the fruit knife next to him. He suddenly had a desire to kill because he was afraid that his father would kill him if he knew everything. Without thinking too much, Beto made up his mind. He took the fruit knife and went to his stepmother's bed. When she heard footsteps, the stepmother looked up and broke down in tears when she saw Beto holding the knife. Beto walked to the bed, only called his stepmother's name once, and suddenly smiled a ghostly smile. That smile scared the stepmother. She knew the one pushing her was Beto. She didn't expect Beto to be so scary. In this situation, Beto was also extremely worried and hesitant about whether to stab his stepmother to death or not. Although she hated Beto very much, the child in her stomach was also lost. The stepmother said she did not intend to denounce Beto and promised to tell everyone she accidentally fell. Just when Beto hesitated and his stepmother was scared, his father suddenly shouted from behind. Beto turned his head in surprise, knowing that he had been discovered. Beto pretended to say that he just wanted to peel apples for his stepmother to eat. However, Beto's father could not believe his explanation because there were no fruits in the room. The father ordered Beto to give him the knife immediately. Holding the knife behind him, Beto tried to cut his hand with the knife. Seeing the blood dripping, Beto's stepmother understood what he meant. She did not want to break the relationship between father and son, so she explained that she wanted to eat apples, but later realized there were no apples in the room. Beto's father immediately believed his wife and said nothing more, gently telling Beto to return home first. Beto rushed home because he didn't dare and didn't want to stay in the hospital anymore. After Beto left, the stepmother hugged Beto's father to relieve the pain in her heart. She also did not tell Beto's crimes to his father. At home, Beto also felt tormented and scared. He was afraid of his stepmother telling the truth and afraid of being sent to a reformatory for criminal children. But after that, everything was fine. A month later, Beto's stepmother was discharged from the hospital, but they did not return home. Later, Beto learned that his father and stepmother had bought another house and started a new life without him. Beto's father would transfer money to him once a month. All Beto's living expenses were covered by his father. When he saw his father leave, Beto was heartbroken. Now Beto felt that the world no longer loved him. Over time, Beto began to live alone. One day, after returning from school, Beto saw the doll he had thrown away lying at the door. The doll still had blood on it, and Beto immediately thought that maybe it was his stepmother who brought it to scare him. Beto didn't even look at the doll. He kicked it away and went into the house. Late at night, when Beto went to sleep, he had a strange dream. In the dream, Beto was chased by a child. The child kept asking Beto to play with him, making Beto extremely scared. Although he could not see the child talking, Beto could completely hear its voice coming from his brain. Chased by the child, Beto risked his life to run forward despite the endless space ahead. While Beto was deep asleep, the doll he kicked in the afternoon suddenly entered the room and stood staring at him in the dark. The doll then jumped onto Beto's face, covering his nose, mouth, and using its weight causing him to suffocate. 2 days later, Beto's father tried to call home several times, but he didn't receive a reply. His father decided to go back home to check it out, and he found out Beto was dead. Beto's eyes, nose, and mouth were all covered with cotton wool. Beto's corpse was so scary that it haunted his father for a long time. Beto's father called the police soon after, and after the police investigated, they did not find any trace of the perpetrator. Therefore, the case was still unfinished. Everyone then focused on Beto's corpse, but no one noticed that in the corner of the room, there was an abandoned doll. It showed a very strange smile. It had a face like a baby and was crying silently. No one knew that inside the doll lived another world, and Beto's soul had been trapped there. Time later, Beto's death still torments Beto's father and stepmother. They only blame themselves for the carelessness that caused the death of their poor son. I had a close friend. He was in the same class and also lived near my house. We used to play very well together, going home together after school. Until one day my friend stopped talking to me and went home alone without waiting for me. I tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't answer me. No matter how many times I called him, he kept silent. It wasn't until I touched his shoulder that he jumped all over, turning to look at me with a listless, panicked face. His face became thinner, more emaciated than before, like it was suffering from some disease. I tried to ask him about it, but he still wouldn't answer any questions. On the contrary, he went straight ahead, silently. His strange attitude confused me. The following day I went to class and saw his mother come to the homeroom teacher to ask him to take a few days off from school. I felt worried about my friend's health, so that afternoon just after school I ran to his house to ask. I went to his house after school. I knocked on the door for a while when his mother opened the door and invited me in. She also said that he was seriously ill. I asked his mother's permission to come into his room to visit him. After receiving the consent, I went straight to my friend's room. I found my friend lying on the bed in the room. His face was clearly worn out. He looked at me with a strange, soulless expression. I pulled up a chair and sat down next to him. As soon as he saw me, he brightened up a bit, but his skin still looked extremely pale. I asked him what was wrong, and he told me he was having a strange problem that kept him awake for many days. I listened to him and became more and more curious, asking what he was all about, why he was so haunted that he couldn't sleep. Until that time, he told me a whole story. A few days ago, he accidentally met a woman on his way home from school. That woman crossed the intersection at the corner of his house but was accidentally hit by a speeding car. After that impact, the injured woman lay in a pool of crimson blood, and the car quickly sped forward and disappeared. He was a witness to the end. He also remembered the license plate of the car that caused the accident. Out of curiosity, he ran to see how the woman was. That woman looked up at him with her whole body covered in blood and weak eyes. She whispered to him. The woman used her weak breath and begged him for help. He called the ambulance and the police to help her. But when he saw the woman whose body was covered in blood, with her voice so weak, my friend also guessed that the woman would not survive. Instead of helping the woman, he coldly walked away. He was afraid that if anyone saw him, he would be the one involved in the accident. After that, he left the woman who got into the accident on the road, and he ran as fast as he could home, pretending not to know anything. Since that day, he did not know about the news of the accident anymore, but he encountered some strange phenomena. Since then, his nature also became taciturn and quiet. His parents asked him no matter what he did not bother to answer a single question. His skin became pale and paler. His eyes were black because of staying up all night, and his body was also extremely weak. Every time he came home from school, he locked himself in the house, refusing to eat. He surprised his worried parents. As for himself, after he abandoned that woman, he always had the feeling that someone was watching him, making him extremely afraid. He also didn't know what was wrong with him. Every day the feeling that someone was behind him became bigger. Every night he seemed to have a fever. The whole body became cold and uncomfortable, and the sweat fell non-stop. He kept dreaming over and over again, one nightmare after the other, that made him so haunted and terrified that he didn't dare to sleep again. In the middle of the night, my friend was screaming in fear. His whole body was struggling as if to escape something. His body always felt heavy, as if there were thousands of rocks pressing on him. It was difficult for him to breathe and move. After a while, he felt like he wanted to die, clearly like someone was strangling him. He wanted to ask his parents for help, but every time something happened, he couldn't open his mouth or say anything. After struggling with that uncomfortable feeling, he finally could sleep again. But the strange dream always haunted him. This time, he felt everything very clearly. My friend thought that he was haunted by the psyche after that woman's accident, so he told his story to his mother, making her very confused. At first, he still tried to go to school, but every time he went out, he became tired, frustrated, and didn't want to meet or interact with anyone. Because of that, his learning was also declining day by day. That night, he decided to tell the whole thing to his parents. He thought that he was suffering from psychological problems because he was so obsessed with the accident. After listening to him, his parents did not stop worrying and discussing how to solve his problems. His father reassured him and said he would take him to see a psychologist for treatment and try his best to comfort and coax him. The following night, his father was so worried about him that his father decided to sleep in my friend's room for the sake of checking. But even if there was his father in the room, that nightmare still happened and scared him. In the middle of the night, his father saw him writhing in the bed. His mouth said something not clear, but he seemed very frightened. After a while, he returned to normal, but tears were already pouring down his face and saliva was running down both cheeks. My friend didn't dare to sleep anymore. He was afraid that every time he slept, that terrible nightmare would happen again. "Daddy, help me! The nightmare is so scary!" His father could only reassure his spirit that he could sleep for a while and be healthy to see the doctor. The following day, his father tried to stick around his bed with golden talismans used to calm his spirit and ward off evil spirits. But these talismans did nothing to protect him. That night the nightmare came back, and it was worse than ever. He seemed to have lost all of his soul. He lay stiff on the bed with his cold body, which made his father extremely worried. He finally couldn't take it anymore and went crazy, screaming all the time. His head began to appear in unpleasant pain. His health also deteriorated day by day. His mother was so worried that she cried all of her tears. She tried to do everything to help him, but in the end, she still could not relieve his condition. Meanwhile, his father went to see a psychologist for advice. His father was advised by his doctor to put a CCTV camera in his room for the doctor to monitor. His parents followed the doctor's orders and put a camera in his room that pointed directly at the bed. Every night, his parents monitored him from the monitor connected to the camera to see how he was doing. Unknowingly during that time, his parents discovered the cause that made him like a person who had lost his mind. In the middle of the night, he had another convulsion. But in the monitor, his parents not only saw him writhing in the room alone, but also another person. It was a hazy woman sitting on the bed, with hands clasped around his neck. Very scary. But at this moment, the strange woman discovered that she was being followed by the camera. She turned a bloody and horror face straight into the camera. His parents panicked and rushed to his room to check, but the woman was nowhere to be found, not even a trace. When his father saw this, he worriedly ran to the bed, trying to wake my friend up. After my friend woke up, he couldn't remember anything. He looked at his father bewilderedly and asked what had happened. His father worried that after knowing everything, my friend was even more scared than before. Therefore, his father decided to hide this horror story from him. But then, his father knew that he couldn't hide it for too long. So, the father played the video he filmed in my friend's room for him to see. When the woman's face appeared, my friend immediately recognized it as the woman he had met. His father was surprised and asked him what relationship he had with this strange woman. He sighed and lowered his face. He admitted that he saw the woman in an accident at that time. She begged for his help, but he ran away. His parents then took him to the police to report the accident and learned that the woman did not survive because of too much blood loss. He also thought that part of the fault was because he didn't help the woman, so she died. So that night, he brought the votive paper to burn at the corner of the intersection. This place was where that accident happened. Then he reported to the police the license plate number and the specific time of the incident for the police to investigate. Fortunately, thanks to his testimony, the police caught the culprit of the accident. His health had since also begun to recover. It happened many years ago when I was only 10 years old, but because I witnessed things I shouldn't have seen, it haunted me to the point where I would never forget it. It was summer and I had a few months vacation. I used to play alone in the small yard in front of the house. A couple living with their elderly mother-in-law lived next door to my house. The neighbor couple frequently quarreled because they were only separated by a wall. I could always hear everything clearly, but I didn't understand what was going on because I was just a child at the time. I thought it was amusing to see them arguing and fighting like that, so whenever I heard an argument, I quickly climbed up to the pile of firewood next to the wall to listen. In this village, that man was known as a henpecked husband. When they fought, it was the wife who would assault him. They could argue about anything, from minor to major. His wife looked like a starving tiger, always rushing to her husband and scratching, so he frequently appeared with many wounds and bruises. This time too, he was scratched all over his face to the point of bleeding in front of his wife. The husband did not dare to fight back. He did not dare to curse back. He could only mumble a few sentences and then try to find a way to flee from his wife. And the wife continued to charge forward. The wife had a fierce face with sharp brows, and she couldn't catch up to her husband each time he ran away, so she could only stand behind and curse. She then went to the front door and sat there, crying and bemoaning her fate. It was always the same. She had no shame. She just wanted to release her anger. Neighbors who heard the screaming and crying gathered to see the funny story, but no one was willing to help or comfort her because the entire village was so used to it. She cried until her face was wet with tears, and she didn't even notice the people laughing around her. She bemoaned the fact that she had been unlucky to marry such a dumb husband. The neighbors had the opportunity to talk and discuss as well, partly because they were fed up with her pointlessness. They believed that having such a daughter-in-law was a bad omen for the husband's family. They began talking about the mother-in-law, and it appeared that the mother-in-law couldn't control this daughter-in-law because whenever there was a problem, she didn't dare to intervene instead of allowing her abuse to continue. Her mother-in-law emerged from the house at the moment. She was very old, her face sorrowful as she looked at the daughter-in-law crying on the ground. She didn't dare to touch her, so she could only offer advice. Not only did it not work, but she was chastised as well. It was only when she cried hoarsely and tiredly and went into the house on her own that it came to an end. The husband fled until the evening before daring to return, but as soon as he got home they continued to argue. I was sleeping, but the arguing woke me up. At the time I wondered how they could live together in such a state. The argument continued until late at night. I wasn't sure when it would end because I also fell asleep during it, unable to wake up. The next morning I was playing ball alone in my yard again, and I kept hearing arguing in the neighbor's house. I knew for a fact that the couple was having an issue again. This time it appeared to be more serious. The wife was holding a large knife, and it seemed that she intended to hack her husband. The husband was terrified and didn't dare to protest. He then ran away from his wife, as he always did, despite her yelling behind him. I still wondered why he didn't have the courage to talk to his wife once to clear things up. It wasn't good to hide like that all the time. She gripped the knife tightly, tears in her eyes, and threatened to kill the entire family. I'd seen them argue before, but this time it was terrifying. I didn't hear their argument that night. Perhaps the husband didn't dare to come home. My mother rushed in from outside the next morning during breakfast to inform my father of some serious news. My mother told me that the wife hanged herself in the house, and when my father heard this, he was astounded. Because the two families were usually very close to each other, when we heard the news, my parents also rushed over there to assess the situation and offer assistance. When I heard about it, I ran after them as well. As a child, I couldn't imagine what it was like to hang to death, so I was eager to take a look. I pushed my way through the throngs outside the door and entered the courtyard, but as soon as I saw it, I was paralyzed with fear. My limbs were drenched in cold sweat and motionless, and I was so terrified that I couldn't move. My eyes kept staring at it. This was the first time I had seen a horrifying scene like this, and I started to regret coming there out of curiosity. A few neighbors were assisting in the removal of her body. Her eyes were rolled up, her mouth wide open, her face pale, and her limbs white. Her dead body hanging from the ceiling. Why did she commit suicide? Her husband wasn't at home at that time. It seemed that he didn't return home all night. When he learned that his wife had been hanged, he returned and went to a burial team to bury his wife's body as soon as possible. According to the burier, the deceased should stay in the house for 3 days before being buried to avoid bad luck, which was an old tradition. But the husband was unconcerned about these traditions. He simply wanted to bury his wife as soon as possible. The burial team also carried the coffin to the village's cemetery quickly because they had been paid and because the tenant had requested it. On the way, the carriers were startled by a noise in the coffin, which sounded like the wife trying to knock on the coffin. When one of the group members heard it clearly, he panicked and told everyone to place the coffin on the ground to assess the situation before moving on. The 4 of them put down the coffin and stood dumbfounded, hoping to hear the knocking again, but it seemed to have stopped. They began to panic, wondering whether they should open the coffin lid to look inside. because the noise was not their imagination, but rather a fear that an animal was hiding inside that would devour the corpse. So the four of them decided to open the coffin lid to see what was inside, even though they were all a little scared. Indeed, seeing the wife's body stunned them. Their faces were blue and bloodless. The wife opened her white eyes. Her mouth was open and stretched her arms forward as if she wanted to strangle someone. She looked very resentful, like she couldn't die in peace. One of the group's most experienced members panicked and hastily asked someone to go to the village and find a heavy object made of silver or steel, but it had to be brought quickly or bad luck would occur. The husband was following them and saw the scene. He got scared and asked the buyer to explain the situation. He wanted to know whether it could be solved or not. According to the berry worker, because the old procedures were incorrect and deceased still harbored a great deal of resentment, if they did not quickly place a jinn-heavy object on top, the body would likely rise. The husband was too scared, so he turned pale when he heard this. Burial workers rushed to close the coffin, but inside it was growing stronger and stronger, and the constant knocking and pounding on the coffin caused it to shake. A moment later, the members of the group returned, holding something resembling a pendulum. The worker placed the steel pendulum gently and carefully on the top of the coffin lid. After a while, everybody kept silent to observe it. It truly worked. There was no sound inside the coffin. Seeing this, they quickly took the coffin and buried it, knowing that this method would not last long. The worker cast a glance at the husband, who smiled slightly as he saw his wife's coffin being buried. He didn't ask many questions. He just warned him that if he was involved in his wife's death, she would eventually find him, and it wouldn't be so simple. And indeed, the mother-in-law witnessed her son hang himself in his room just a few days later. He died the same way as his wife. The entire village believed she forced him to follow her, which I wouldn't know for sure. They didn't live happily together, and even death didn't want to set them free from each other. So they left, leaving the old mother to suffer alone. That year, around the summer of 2009, the story happened to Yang's family. He was about 8 years old at the time, and on the occasion of the holiday, Yang's family decided to return to their hometown for a few days. It was Yang's first trip out of town, and he was very excited because it was in the countryside, far from the city, and convenient for visiting his grandparents' graves. Walked a little further from the bus station through some houses to reach the grandparents' house because no one had lived there in a long time. The Yang family had to clean up as soon as they arrived. After a long day of work, it was already dark when the three of them sat around the dining table. However, Yan acted strangely during the meal. He was looking out the door and smiling while eating, which drew Yang's mother's attention. She also looked out the door, but there was no one in the yard. But Yang kept looking at the door, then talked as if he was joking with his friends. He turned his face outside and howled loudly that they should wait until he finished eating before going outside to play, which made Yang's mother felt even stranger. Yang quickly let go of his chopsticks when he'd just eaten a little bit, wanted to go out and play with his friends. Yang's mother didn't think much at the time, as she thought that he was just a playful boy, so he did it on purpose to make them allow him to go out to play. And she also gently told Yang that he had just arrived here for the first time. How come he had any friends? But Yang insisted, pointing to the yard and saying that some friends were standing outside calling him out to play with them for a while already. When Yang's father heard that, he became concerned. He assumed that because he was tired from the long journey, he had become ill or developed a fever. But no matter how he explained, no one could see the three spirits outside, waving to Yang. They were also children, About Yang's age, 2 boys and 1 girl with very happy faces but pale skin, and they were constantly inviting him to go out and play with them. Yang was just a kid, so he didn't think much about ghosts or humans when he saw friends waving at him, so he raised his hand, smiled, and waved back. At this point, Yang's parents were very concerned, looked at the door in the direction Yang waved, but they couldn't see anyone. Yang's father was worried that his son would have developed a fever, so he'd instructed his wife to check his temperature. The wife checked hastily, thinking her son was ill, but after a while Yang's body was completely normal, with no fever or anything. Seeing this, Yang's father believed that his son was mischievous, so he asked Yang to go to bed early. He'd been traveling all day, so he obeyed his father and went to bed. Yang planned to go out tomorrow afternoon to play with her friends, so the entire family quickly cleaned up and went to bed early. Around midnight, there was a sound of children laughing and whispering outside the windows, as if they were calling someone. Yang's father was too tired today, so he didn't react. He couldn't hear the sound at all. Yang's mother, on the other hand, was more sensitive. The noise was minor, but it woke her up. The first thing Yang's mother noticed when she opened her eyes was that Yang had disappeared, and she had no idea where or when he had left the bed. Normally, when they traveled or went to strange places, Yang would also wake up his mother to take him to the toilet. She became concerned and got out of bed to go find Yang. As she passed by the window, she heard children's laughter that sounded very similar to Yang's, so Yang's mother went out to look out the window. Went to the window, looked out at the yard. She planned to open the glass windows to take a look around. However, before she could open the glass, the terrifying sight caused her to scream in terror. Yang was clearly visible at this point, sitting under a tree in the yard, playing with the ground and surrounded by 3 other children. Yang, on the other hand, sat on the ground, his hands constantly digging for something, and his expression was very strange. The mother was so terrified that she could only scream, which woke Yang's father up. The children outside in the yard heard Yang's mother's voice and turned to look at her through the window. Their eyes were white with no irises. Their mouths had a devilish smile, and Yang appeared to have missed his mother's voice. They immediately became enraged when they noticed Yang's mother standing at the window and spotted them. They didn't want others to bother Yang, and they seemed to have manipulated Yang into doing something. Yang looked like a lost soul right now. Yang's father also jumped out of bed to rush to his wife's aid. He still had no idea what was going on. Yang's mother was so terrified that she nearly fainted. After assisting his wife, he also looked out the window to see what was happening to her. Yang's father was a man who had served in the army. Seeing his son surrounded by ghostly children, he stormed the door and went out into the yard. The children slowly dispersed as Yang's father approached, and Yang was still digging in the ground with his hands. The 3 spirits did not forget to leave a ghostly smile before disappearing. Their shapes also became devilishly twisted and vanished. He went to the tree where Yang was sitting and called out for him, but he didn't respond. When he saw that, he hastily lifted Yang up. Yang's body had just seemed to melt, with no resistance at all. His hands remained clutching the dirt below until his father lifted him up. He refused to let go. Both his hands, feet, and his clothes were soiled. His face was white, his mouth was still wet with saliva. His eyes were open, but he appeared to be sleeping, like a sleepwalker. Yang's father shook him constantly, fearful that something would happen to his son, and kept telling him to wake up. Fortunately, Yang's expression began to change after a while, and his eyes were no longer wide open. Yang's fingernails were painful because he had been digging in the ground with his bare hands for a long time. Yang burst into tears after regaining consciousness. Yang's parents escorted him to his room, cleaned the dirt for him, and cleaned the wound to prevent infection. Yang's father then inquired as to what had occurred earlier and why Yang had gone out to the yard. Yang whimpered about everything, even though he was afraid his parents would scold him. He was awakened in the middle of the night by the children's laughter, so he looked outside to see what was going on. Outside the window at the time, Yang noticed 3 children waving to him, accompanied by happy laughter, calling Yang to come play with them. Yang realized they were 3 children whom he had seen while having dinner. Yang was too young. He had no doubts when he jumped out of bed to go out. Yang opened the door and looked around for them. After all, they were all children, so it was understandable that they wanted to play. Yang noticed a large tree in the yard with silhouettes of children in the distance at this point. He intended to open the door to take a look, but the children kept calling from a distance. So for some reason he ran towards them unintentionally. Yang, on the other hand, felt nothing out of the ordinary and simply inquired as to why they were staying out so late. They didn't mean to keep it a secret from him. They said they died a few years ago. That surprised Yang. They claimed that someone kidnapped, murdered, and buried them under this tree, and they wanted Yang to save them. Hearing this, Yang sat down unconsciously, began digging, and then couldn't remember anything. After all, Yang wasn't afraid, and he still wanted his parents to save the children. Yang's parents were perplexed by this. They exchanged glances but said nothing. It was difficult to believe, but everything that happened tonight made them concerned a lot. They put Yang to sleep, intended to solve the problem tomorrow. The next day, Yang's father asked his village neighbors to dig up the soil beneath the tree, and as Yang stated, they had only dug a little when a skeleton was discovered beneath the mud and soil. After digging was completed, 3 sets of small skeletons were discovered beneath the tree. They immediately reported it to the police and clarified everything. According to Yang, they caught the killers. They were the girl's uncle and aunt. 2 years ago, due to a lack of money, they lured the girl to invite 2 more friends over to play and then arrested all 3 children. Someone wanted to buy them for a high price, so they loaded the 3 children into the trunk and began transporting them. They pulled over in the middle of the road to rest and also opened the trunk to inspect the children's situation. The children couldn't stand the distance and the heat of the summer, so they suffocated and died. They didn't know what to do at the time, so they dug a hole in the ground and buried the children's bodies there. Yang's grandmother died a long time ago, and Yang's parents also rarely visited, so almost no one knew about this. But they would never know. Evil deeds would be discovered. The children had been waiting for Yang for a long time. They knew that they would be saved. It occurred in 2008 in a small village north of Hiroshima, Japan. That was my real-life experience as a child. That year, during the National Day holiday, my father drove from Shimane to take me and my mother home to see my grandmother. I was only 10 years old at the time, and I loved the countryside. I was fascinated by everything there. I kept asking questions and making my parents uncomfortable throughout. We drove for more than 4 hours and arrived in a village around 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Grandma's house was still a typical country house at the time, with a large yard and 2 rooms, 1 main house and 1 warehouse. At the time, I could only visit her twice a year, once for National Day and once for the Lunar New Year, so my grandmother was desperate for me to return. But I was not used to her zeal because I hadn't seen her since I was a child, and I was not particularly close to her. When we entered the house, Grandma and my parents were discussing their daily life. I looked for a chance to get away from her grip. I would never dare to go out by myself, so I climbed the ladder to reach the warehouse roof. There were only high-rise buildings in the city. As for standing here and being able to see the entire village, it felt very new to me, so I stood here and looked around. I suddenly felt chills behind me as the sky darkened. I had the impression that someone was keeping an eye on me. I looked behind unconsciously and I felt a shadow passing behind me. I quickly turned around and saw a shirt hanging on a bamboo pole next to the chimney. The roof of Grandma's warehouse connected to the neighbor's house, and the clothes were on the neighbor's roof. But this wasn't a problem for me. My parents and I fell asleep after dinner that night because we were tired. But unexpectedly at midnight, I had a nightmare. I was not sure why the shirt hanging on the roof of my neighbor's house appeared in my dream. In the black mist, that piece of shirt kept getting closer to me, and it was becoming clearer and clearer. As I looked closer, I noticed a figure dressed in clothes hanging from a bamboo pole. I gradually realized that the man was an elderly man, his face contorted in pain, and he was terrified. The old man got closer and closer until he was right in front of me, his mouth wide open, as if he wanted to scream at me. I could feel him screaming, but I couldn't hear anything. The old man pressed his mouth to my ear and made strange buzzing noises, and I had no idea what he was trying to say. I had the impression that he shouted for a long time in the dream, but I couldn't understand a single word. I was not sure how long the situation would last. I could feel my awareness fading. Then I heard my parents' voices calling out to me. I struggled to open my eyes, seeing my parents' worried expressions in front of me. "Wake up, my son," my father said. It turned out that I was screaming while sleeping. So many strange things happened at once. My father asked, "What happened to you? You kept screaming in your dream, and your body is sometimes hot, sometimes cold." My parents were concerned about me and woke me up. I was feeling strange on the inside, so I told them about my dream. After that, I fell asleep again until dawn when I woke up. I overheard my mother said that I appeared to be dreaming again. My parents didn't think much of it at the time, but they had to inform my grandmother anyway. Surprisingly, as soon as my grandmother heard it, she became enraged, as if she knew what had caused it. However, my grandmother did not say anything clearly at the time, but instead walked out the door and began cursing. Grandma was a typical rural old woman. When she was angry, her words were difficult to bear, and my parents were powerless to stop her. Grandma scolded the neighbors, sounding like she was scolding an old man. Grandma's scolding was becoming increasingly louder. Her language was becoming increasingly unbearable, and this was the first time I had seen her so enraged. "If I hadn't made your ancestors' graves for you, you wouldn't be where you are now," my grandmother exclaimed. To be honest, we didn't know what was going on, but I thought Grandma scolding like this was extremely inappropriate. Dad approached her and drew her into the house because we didn't want her yelling at the neighbors any longer. We all found it strange that Grandma's anger remained after she was dragged back. My father inquired about what had happened and why my grandmother was so enraged. Grandma drank 2 sips of water and then told us a story about the neighbor's house. It turned out that the neighbor's house was previously considered a poor household in the village, but the house was recently purchased and relocated for more than a year. Once upon a time, this family had an elderly man who lived with his son and daughter-in-law. That family's daughter-in-law was a fierce woman, especially unfaithful, lazy all day and forcing her father-in-law to work hard. He was also old and frail. It was said that when he was younger he was terrified of his wife. When his wife died, he let his daughter-in-law rule and he worked very hard. His daughter-in-law once asked him to go to the river to water vegetables at noon. He started to be dizzy as a result of heat stroke. He couldn't stand, so he fell into the river, wouldn't get up, couldn't get up, and eventually drowned. The old man died just like that. Looks like he had a grudge that he couldn't swallow, because when he died, one eye was closed and the other was wide open, as if he was unwilling. Ever since that day, there had been rumors about ghosts appearing in the neighbor's house. Nearly every night his daughter-in-law's screams could be heard by his neighbors. It was said that the daughter-in-law dreamt of the old man every night, wanting her to follow him, and that every night she woke up startled, unable to sleep. Then, not knowing where she learned how to solve it, she found an old shirt worn by the old man when he was still alive. She put it on a bamboo pole and erected it on a chimney. According to a legend, this allowed the old man's ghost to bask in the sun like fire during the day, and at night it was as cold as an ice pillar. When my parents heard what my grandmother said, they were all enraged because of such a daughter-in-law. My mother exclaimed that she was to blame, and my father agreed, saying, "It's a shame that the old man can't be at peace until he died." Grandma didn't say anything else after seeing my father and mother react so angrily. Things went on like that. I had no problems, and my grandmother urged my parents to go back to the city. Grandma was concerned that I would be injured again. Every time I returned to my hometown, I discovered something new and liked a lot of things. But after that incident, I was a little scared. When I left, I discovered that shirt still hanging on the side of the chimney, and I was not sure if the old man was a living ghost. This scary story happened in a fishing village in China a few years ago. There was a woman who had been waiting for someone under the lighthouse at the pier for 7 days. She was the wife of Fang, a fisherman. On the day Fang set sail, his boat was suddenly hit by a storm and had not returned for 7 days. Although her son advised her to return home, the wife still waited there. Fang's wife had been waiting on the pier for 7 days now. Each time she was dragged home by her son to stop waiting. This village was a typical fishing village of Fujian province, China. The people were all fishing on the sea, so sometimes shipwrecks were inevitable. Finally, the bad news came on the 8th day. The son then panicked and ran to the reporter to tell his mother that he had seen Fang's body washed up on the beach. The wife had already guessed the outcome, but in her heart she still hoped that her husband would return safely. Fang's body was soaked in water for a long time, so it looked terrible when it washed up on the beach. Fang's corpse was densely covered with sea creatures such as sea clams and conches. These often attached themselves to dead bodies in the sea. The people saw this and immediately helped clean Fang's body from sea clams and conch and brought his body home for burial. Those sea snails adhered to the skin of the decomposing corpse. When the people pulled the snail out with his hand, the snail would bring a piece of meat or skin from the corpse. The people made great efforts to help. People brought the body back to the village, prepared it for burial. Most people in shipwrecks died in such a tragic way. Sea clams and conch were removed from Fang's corpse still on the beach. After dark, a group of young people was walking by the beach. The sea was extremely cool but contained many dangers and death. These 3 young people all worked in town and turned back to the village at night to rest. That day they invited each other to go out to relieve stress. One of the groups, Han, found the sea clams and conches scattered on the beach. The group didn't know where the sea clams and conch came from, but these conches looked delicious. The rest of the group said, "These people are a waste. These delicious big conch are thrown here. This thing is a real bargain." So the whole group packed those snails and prepared them to bring home to cook and eat. The group did not forget to laugh happily because they accidentally caught delicious bait. The sky suddenly became pitch black, and clouds were gathering in the evening. The houses near the sea were quiet. The group went home to cook snails and make some small dishes, and then they started drinking. People lived near the sea that had one thing in common. They knew that the meat of this conch was very tender and juicy. This conch was large and had lots of meat. The young men pulled out the snail meat with a small toothpick. The snail was completely separated from the shell. The appearance was a little scary, but the meat was delicious. The conch was an expensive food in the city, therefore these young people couldn't ignore the immediate benefit. The group of young people used toothpicks to get the snail meat and ate happily. They looked like they were eating well. But only Han didn't eat any snails. "Why don't you eat it?" a young man asked Han. "I'm allergic to snails, so I can't try. You guys just eat it. I was scared when I looked at it," Han said. So the two remaining people gossiped and quickly ate all the conch. After eating, the group went to bed because it was past midnight. Because 3 young men were tired and had a little yeast in them, they slept soundly. Han also quickly fell asleep because he was too tired. Just sleeping for a while, Han was suddenly woken up by terrible screams. He still couldn't figure out where these screams were coming from because he was still sleepy. It turned out that one of his co-workers was sick. But isn't he sick? Han saw that person writhing in pain, his whole body arched, his whole body covered in a deadly gray. His stomach felt like something was moving. His belly was gradually bulging high, bulging like a pregnant woman. His belly was constantly expanding, the underbelly was twisting back and forth, looking very scary. Han was frightened by the sight and immediately went to his friend's bed to help him. At that time, there were also screams of pain from behind. Han wondered what had happened again. Han looked back. His other friend was also in great pain, to the point of kneeling on the bed. His whole body had blue veins, so painful that he gnashed his teeth as if he couldn't stand it anymore. Han did not dare to delay when he saw the situation. He immediately ran out to find a doctor. After a while, Han found a doctor who had been working in the village for more than 30 years. When the doctor arrived, Han's 2 friends passed out from the pain. The 2 of them looked like they were dead. Han looked at them with fear. The doctor said they had eaten something unclean. That was why it happened. Han told the doctor about these 2 eating the conches tonight. "We picked up some conch and mussels today. The 2 of them ate them," Han told the doctor. After listening, the doctor told Han about the terrible origin of those conches. Han's face paled from fear. The doctor said that conch and mussels were the things that contained the evilest spirits in the sea. They like to suck the yin gas of the dead. If we eat them a lot, they would be very harmful to our health. After that, the doctor went to get a bunch of sticky rice to soak in water. This way was a cure for conch poisoning. The doctor asked Han to give his water to his friends to drink so 2 friends could recover from their illness. After being poured a lot of sticky rice water into their mouths, the other 2 started vomiting madly. The scary thing was that the spit out conch meat was not completely digested, still intact with the shape of the conch. In ancient times, it was believed that conches and sea mussels could absorb yin and form pearls. Most sea snails and mussels were not very clean creatures at all. When it came to the profession of carrying coffins, there were many taboos as well as scary stories happening around it. For example, a person doing this job was absolutely not allowed to have sex the night before, not to get married or have children, to avoid injury, and not to let blood get on the coffin. And most important taboo was that from the moment the coffin was lifted until the grave was reached, the coffin must not touch the ground. And the person carrying the coffin must not complain or say negative words, no matter how tired they were. Speaking of which, I want to tell you about a true story that happened in my village. That year, a 70-year-old woman died of illness in my village. Her family also held a funeral for her. At the time, the management of funerals was very strict due to concerns about epidemics. The older woman family hired workers from a nearby mine for the burial. And these people knew absolutely nothing about the burial customs in our village. Taking advantage of the early morning hours, they proceeded to carry the coffin, not knowing that something terrible was waiting for them ahead. They did not have much experience in burial, but it must be said that they were in good health. Carrying the coffin was not a problem for them, because to ensure safety, not to violate the government's ban, the funeral took place without drums, and everyone went quietly to the back of the mountain. In the past, our villagers used to bury their relatives in a cemetery in the forest. It was about 2 kilometers from the village. The path was not difficult at all. However, while carrying the coffin near the cemetery, the coffin carriers suddenly felt that something was wrong. The coffin suddenly became very heavy, and the road became steeper, making the steps quite heavy too. Everyone felt that the road that day seemed a bit strange. "Oh my God! Why is it so heavy?" said one of the group members carrying the coffin. His elbows were shaking from the coffin's weight. Before they could continue, everyone felt that the coffin was a bit heavier than usual. The weight made the group stop because they couldn't stand it anymore. At this point, one of the group thought that maybe due to going uphill the coffin would be heavier. The man did his best to exhort the people in the group to keep going. It was also close to the cemetery at that time. Everyone in the group tried to carry the coffin with all their might, even though it was growing strangely heavier. And at that very moment, something monstrous happened. The coffin suddenly shook violently. Then there were loud noises on the coffin lid. It seemed that someone inside was trying to break through to get out. The old woman had been dead for a few days. Was it possible that the old woman had come back to life? Family members of the old woman were also surprised. The coffin shook more and more violently each day, accompanied by high-pitched explosions coming from the coffin. The coffin carriers were trying their best at this point, but the weight of the coffin held them tightly. Suddenly an explosion rang out in the sky, accompanied by the boos of many people around. The coffin fell to the ground because of the steep slope. The people carrying the coffin fell backwards. Both the body and the coffin slid down the slope. The coffin slid down the slope for a while and then stopped. Everyone rushed over to hold the coffin upright. At that time, the family members of the old woman also expressed panic. They looked at each other without knowing what to do next. Scary things kept happening. Inside the coffin, the sound of smashing continued to be deafening. The noise grew louder in this quiet forest. The noises were getting louder by the moment as the old woman inside was seemingly about to rush out. The onlookers felt extremely frightened. Everyone panicked. It was the first time people had encountered such a situation. Someone was going to take a rope to open the coffin and take a look inside. Just then, an old man approached and said that they had broken some taboos against the dead. "Come on, one of you got hurt, right?" The old man was an experienced person in this matter because he had seen such a situation in his youth, so he asked. Sure enough, someone was injured during the mining process among the workers carrying the coffin. So the old man quickly lit incense and prayed for the soul of the old woman to forgive their mistakes. The old man said that the wounds on the workers' hands had accidentally caused blood to stick to the coffin walls. This thing was a taboo. Everyone must kneel and ask for forgiveness. The old woman's family and the workers carrying the coffin nervously watched the old man's actions. Incense was lit, and the old man also performed the ritual to apologize to the deceased. Just burning paper, the old man prayed for the old woman to pass away peacefully. Everyone knelt around to bow to the coffin. At this point, the wind was strong, and the inside of the coffin kept making shrill noises. However, the coffin had not stopped. The old man suspected that there was still guilt on the part of the family. He asked the old woman's relatives to sincerely admit their mistakes, and after a while the coffin stopped shaking. Everyone gradually returned to its original calm state. Suddenly, the old woman's son explained that it was indeed the fault of him and his wife, because last night they slept together. The old man explained that thing was a taboo to do, to have sex in the family that night. Luckily, the apology was accepted by the dead. People continued to carry the coffin up towards the burial. From that moment on, nothing happened. The coffin was taken to the cemetery and properly buried. Later, I learned more taboos about coffin carrying. There were scary things that could cost people their lives. Later, when I have a chance, I will tell you all about it.